Imagine, you've been saving for a very long time, working hard to afford your own home, and finally, you've managed to save enough for the apartment of your dreams. The deal goes through, all the paperwork is completed, the apartment is yours, but you don't get even the chance to enjoy the fact that you own it, because the seller goes to court and claims that they sold the apartment under the influence of scammers, and the court declares the transaction invalid. You lose your money, the apartment, and any hope of justice. It sounds absurd, but dozens of people in Russia have become victims of this kind of scheme, and this phenomenon even has a name, the Dolina effect, named after the most high-profile case, which I'll talk about in this video. But before we begin, I need to give you some context. The Dolina effect is named after Larisa Dolina, a well-known Russian performer. In the late Soviet Union and in Russia up until around the 2000s, the musical genre of estrada was very popular. In practice, it was a very strict, elitist circle of officially recognized performers that an ordinary person simply couldn't enter. Even though Dolina wasn't among the absolute top stars, this still brought her wealth, connections, and quite obviously a star sickness. Public outrage peaked in 2021, when one of the most well-known examples of her arrogance occurred on the show Musicality, which brings together older generation performers and younger musicians to discuss modern music and hear the opinions of established artists. Dolina appeared in an episode with TikTok creator Валя Carnaval. Throughout the episode, she behaved in an extremely condescending manner. She was rude, and the problem was her tone, which many perceived as openly dismissive.
Для нас с Валей, чтобы мы повторили, расслабились.
Ты уверен?
Да, да.
Ну, хорошо.
Ну, что-нибудь такое, я тоже никогда не учился. Угу, давай.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. There are various interviews and statements from people who have worked with her that describe similar behavior, but the peak was an interview in which she claimed that police officers literally cannot stop her.
Государственная автоинспекция. Вы как поступите, как честный человек или отмажетесь?
Вы знаете, если бы у меня не было специального документа, о котором я не просила, мне его выдал наш самый главный гаишник России, меня не имеют права останавливать, мою машину вообще.
I think it's important to emphasize this, because her behavior sets the stage for what happens next. The whole story began in the spring of 2024. According to Dolina, it started with a phone call from someone posing as director of the institute where she teaches. The voice was generated using AI. He told her that her money was at risk. From there, everything followed a classic scam pattern. Within a short period of time, she was contacted by people claiming to be representatives of security services and other government agencies. They convinced her that the funds needed to be urgently transferred to secure accounts, while also forbidding her from informing the bank or her relatives. Even at this stage, there were several obvious red flags. But even when actual bank employees tried to stop the transaction and expressed doubts, Dolina explained the transfers as preparations for her concert tour. In other words, she didn't just ignore the warning, she deliberately provided a false explanation. Then, the situation escalated even further. The scammers convinced her that someone was trying to take out a loan using her apartment as collateral, and that, to protect the property, she needed to sell it urgently. At the same time, they promised that she would be able to get the apartment back later. As a result, according to Dolina, she sold it significantly below market value for around $1.6 million instead of $2.6 million. However, the future buyer's lawyer claims that the final price was justified. There are quite a few questions about this whole story and Dolina's actions. First of all, it's unclear why the rector would even know about any supposed threat, and why she didn't simply verify it with the real rector, considering she continued teaching there the entire time. Secondly, why didn't it raise suspicion that alleged representatives of government agencies were contacting her directly, when that's not even part of their responsibilities? But do you know what the most funniest red flag was? One of the scammers, as proof that he was a government employee, I'm not joking. Showed her a passport with a photo of Tom Holland. Yes, Spider-Man Far From Home, or maybe Far From Common Sense. We have already covered the bank part, but the most troubling action still remains. Dolina knew the deal was essentially fictitious, yet she went through with it anyway, setting up an ordinary woman. So there is really no reason to justify Dolina here, because in the end she chose to protect her own money at the expense of someone else. In June, the buyer, Polina Lurie, transferred the money and the parties signed the contract. Immediately afterward, Dolina passed the money on the third parties and refused to vacate the apartment she had just sold. Then, in August, she filed a lawsuit claiming that the deal should be annulled because the sale had been carried out under the influence of the third parties. As a result, on March 28, 2025, the court declared the transaction invalid, stripped Polina Lurie of her ownership rights to the apartment, and didn't require Dolina to return the money to the buyer. Naturally, the sheer unfairness of the situation caused a major public backlash. Dolina faced widespread criticism, cancel campaigns, and a wave of memes.
Лариса, у нас к вам секретное поручение. Вы человек в этих вопросах опытный. Летите в США, возвращайте Аляску и Калифорнию. Мол, тогда все напутали, мошенники царей обманули. Сделку надо откатить.
Служу России.
Это Лариса Долина. Пропал наш славный городок. Лучше бы это были мексиканские головорезы.
And it wasn't just ordinary people talking about it. Even major companies like Burger King publicly blacklisted Larisa Dolina. Russia doesn't really have a well-established cancel culture, but the Dolina case can, in a way, be seen as one of the first large-scale examples of it. Dolina herself stayed silent and avoided public statements. In 2024, there was a video in which she generally described herself as a victim of fraud.
Здравствуйте. В связи с большим количеством вопросов от представителей СМИ я вынуждена дать небольшой комментарий по поводу сложившейся ситуации. Я стала жертвой мошенников.
Throughout the legal process and everything surrounding it, she made no further comments. But apparently, after the court ruling, the backlash and public reaction were so intense that she gave a short interview about the whole situation.
Полина Лурье не виновата в том, что меня обманули мошенники. Она не виновата в этом. Поэтому я приняла единственное решение вернуть ей деньги за квартиру.
In that interview, Dolina offered to return the money to Polina Lurie, but on extremely unfavorable terms. She proposed paying it back not as a lump sum, but in small installments. Naturally, Polina refused such a great offer, where it would take around 6 years to recover the full amount, not to mention the losses due to inflation. Dolina claims that she doesn't have that kind of money, although personally I find that hard to believe. After the scandal, people started digging into her past and bringing up previous issues. It turned out that she had an unregistered cottage and owed around $80,000 in taxes on it. After her initial loss, Polina Lurie filed several appeals, but the courts rejected them and upheld the decision in Dolina's favor. And the situation might not have caused such outrage if the ruling hadn't so clearly favored only one side. It's unclear why the buyer should be held responsible for what the seller does with the money after the transaction is completed. However, public pressure likely played a role, because the case was eventually taken up by the Supreme Court of Russia, and on December 25th, the court ruled that the ownership rights to the apartment belonged to Polina Lurie and that Dolina must vacate the property. Dolina refused to leave the apartment for about another month, so the new owner was only able to move in on January 19, 2026. In the end, this is one of those cases where you can only be glad for Polina Lurie and for the fact that justice ultimately prevailed. In the end, the Dolina case remains the most significant precedent involving this type of scam scheme. The market, as always, adjusted itself, but there are definitely victims, and all that's left is to hope that justice prevails, that those affected are able to recover from it, and that future buyers won't have to face the same situation.
If you watched this video all the way to the end,
subscribe to the channel and give it a like. In the future, more videos about Russian culture are coming. Mike Propel, more to come.